What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel. As you see, we are surrounded by huge Chevy pickup trucks. As you guys remember, we did a full 9-inch off-road design coilover conversion lift on this truck. There was a whole lot of questions and a whole lot of comments on the step-by-step process on doing the installation of it. We didn't really take too much time to go over all that stuff because we were concentrating on a whole bunch of details. But here we are with a 1989 Chevy crew cab, big old boy. And all we're doing is a 9-inch lift on it. So we're gonna take a little bit more time and kind of go over all the steps with you guys. This thing's already huge, man. It's got this huge front bumper on it. And it's also swapped with a 12-valve Cummins turbo diesel, man. So this thing is already really cool, already really massive. But what's gonna make it even more massive and cool is another 9-inch coilover conversion lift. So Dave, we got Dave out here, our lead fabricator. Dave, what's gonna be the first step on this?
All right, we gotta get this inside and onto our lift, and it's a massive vehicle, so we gotta make sure everything fits in the shop. Once it's up in the air, we got a whole table full of nuts and bolts and brackets, and we gotta make sure everything's there.
All right, well, it's hot outside, so let's get this thing in there and let's get to work.
After going through our list over here, I wrote down a couple items that I did not find. Front link arm hardware is missing, the heims and the welding spacers are missing, and this is a really important one. The two main brackets that mount the coilover shock and spring assemblies to the front axle. But everything else is here and accounted for. You don't want to get things stuck on the lift, stuck on your jack stands, so it's really important to go over all the parts, make sure that everything arrived as it should. I sort of divide the table into 3 different sections. This is rear parts, this is steering components, and this is front suspension parts. While we were organizing our parts, we realized that there were a few things missing for our front suspension. So starting over here at the rear, we have our raw bar material. These are going to be our 4 links in the rear. These are our bump stops to prevent the suspension from compressing past a certain point to protect our shocks. These two are the brackets that get welded to the frame side, and the ends of our 4-link bars get Johnny joints, and they're gonna be bolted into these brackets. These 2 brackets here are a frame mount shock bracket. Top of our rear shock coilovers get bolted into these. These are 2 brackets for 2 of our 4-link arms to connect from the frame into the axle tube. These 2 brackets are for the other 2 tubes in our 4-link system, and they actually get welded to the top of this. This is actually upside down, it'll get flipped. These curved pieces here, they meet with the axle tube. We talked about Johnny joints. This is what a Johnny joint looks like. That's what's gonna slip into these brackets here. These 2 brackets on the axle side are gonna be flex joints. It's a kind of a raw piece of tube that has a threaded on the inside, and then you have to build them yourself, and it's a ball and socket style assembly that sits inside the flex joint housing and allows some rotational movement, and they get greased just like ball joint would. So we got all the rear components, 4 links, our brackets, our hardware, so we could start tearing into this rear end. So we got both these fuel tanks all drained of fuel. So we're gonna put a drain pan under, disconnect this line. Hopefully there's not too much left in the tank, and then we'll be able to start dropping these tanks. We got this behemoth up on the lift, but we're not exactly level yet. So I'm gonna grab a level. We're gonna try and get this truck exactly level because it's gonna make it so much easier when we're trying to build and get all of our dimensions correct. Now that we're all level, I think that since we are doing a bed lift and a cab lift, it would be advantageous for us to just take the bed fully off since it has to be raised anyway. So we got a bunch of bolts that I'm gonna take off now. Some stuff mounted to the bed. I'm gonna pull this fuel pump off and then lift the bed off with the lift, put it on the cart. We're just gonna get a few measurements that we need before we pull our axle, specifically our pinion angle. That way we can make sure we're putting it back at the same angle at which it came off. And Looks like we're right between 12 and 13 degrees right here. We got our bed off, out the way of the bed and the toolbox and everything. This thing is taking a nosedive forward. We're gonna get the rear off first, lower onto these jack stands by the frame, and then what we can do is lift our front end up, take our wheels off, and then we got some jack stands there, and then we can actually re-level our frame out and then be able to build off at that point. We got our rear end out and our leaf springs off. Our frame is all clean. Now we got to clean up this rear axle to accept all of our new bracketry. I got the cross brace here. Well, is removing all the brake lines. And once we get this clear, put this bracket on, make sure it's going to work. And then also start test fitting a couple of our other brackets. So our next general step is getting all of our bracketry put on so we can make our 4-link bars to link the axle up to the frame. What we want to do, since 2 of our 4-link brackets are welded on the top of our brace, we need to get the brace fixed onto the axle, even if it's just tacked in for now. So that way when we put the axle under, we know the actual position. So the position of the brace is determined on this side. So what we're gonna do is get the brace vinyl welded to itself. We'll get the pinion part of it bolted on, and then we'll connect the two, and then that'll place this and we'll be able to tack it onto the axle. So we got our main brace all welded up, so we're going to move on to our pinion cover. So this part covers where the drive shaft connects onto the axle, and then this part bolts onto the front face of the axle housing. But this comes unwelded. Hard to do one-handed. But now we could get a better idea. We got the pinion cover and bracket bolted into the front face of our pinion, and this brace here gets bolted in like this, and then that will dictate exactly where this one wants to sit. So I'm gonna go ahead and bolt on this piece here, and then we'll rotate this and get it lined up to this whole assembly. We got this piece bolted on to our front. We're gonna drill some holes up here, and we'll be able to bolt these 2 pieces together using some 1/2-inch hardware. This is one of our 4-link brackets. It's gonna get welded on top. Just put it up there for reference. I have the pinion set, and so from the side, it's close to being parallel with the ground. That's really the starting point you want. So before we actually tack this in place, I made some marks underneath through the holes that exist. We're gonna take the brace off, flip it, drill through those holes, and then put it back in, make sure our hardware slips through before giving tacks on the actual axle. That way we know that everything is aligned before we actually do any welding. Okay, so we got our 3 holes now drilled in the top. We're gonna test it out, make sure all of our hardware mates up to this bottom bracket. With this pinion cover bolted in and this bracket bolted in, this is the exact position that the bracket needs to be in. We can finally do a couple tacks on either side. I'm gonna start working on this, our frame side. We got these big brackets, there's one right here, and they mount up directly on the side of this frame. What we're gonna do is just actually box in this entire section right here that the bracket's gonna go onto. Boxing will give strength to the actual frame, and then once the bracket's on, there's gonna be a bunch more weldable surfaces to make that attachment and tie it into the frame. Okay, so we got both our boxed in plates installed. Passenger, driver, driver, passenger. And now we got to tack in our 4-link brackets. But before we do that, I want to show you guys the way that this bracket is going to sit. Is that box and plate is going to be on this side, and this is going to be the bottom of the frame rail. You could have the ability to weld here, here, and then on this side and this side, and the top side with our box and plate. Okay, so we got a few tacks on either side. That's good enough for the mock-up stage of this process. Next, we got to get this axle underneath the frame and then set level, just like the frame is. And then also jack stand to adjust our pinion height. Other considerations, we want to be centered left to right. And then also, I made these marks before taking off the original position of the axle with the leaf springs. And that gives us a center line of where we want to be. Now that we're in position, we can check out our ride height. 8.5 is the stock distance between the bottom of the frame and the top of the axle tube. So now we're up here at 19 inches distance. So 8, 19, do some math, Kalel.
8 plus 19?
No, 19 minus 8.
19 minus 8, 11.
11. So we are 11 inches taller than stock. Right now, we got everything positioned perfectly. Our frame itself is level in both directions, and now our axle is level, the pinion angle set, and it's positioned front to back, left to right exactly where we want it. Our next step now is we can start tacking our brackets onto our axle tube in position, and then once those are tacked, we can start making our 4-link bars. So and we have brackets for our outer link arms tacked on to the axle side, and we have our bracket tacked on to our frame side. So the first step that we're going to do is we're going to build this arm. Tighten it down. We got this all tacked in, our flex joint, and we're gonna bring it over to our truck over here, and it will go inside this axle end. And then once I have it in this side, we can hold it up to here. We're gonna install a joint joint on here with the welding end, and then we'll be able to match it up and be able to mark for our cut on our other side of our pipe. So we got our first link installed, the hardware running through, holding our flex joint in, runs up, reamed out our cut for the insert, and then the Johnny joint threads into the insert, and then the hardware holds it to the frame side bracket. Got adjustment if we need to make it shorter or if we need to go out. Next step, pretty much we just have to repeat this process, exactly the same for the other side, and then we'll move on to the middle one. Okay, we are under the truck and we are setting in our inner links here. So we coped and tacked the flex joint onto the end, and then this is the bracket that's gonna get welded to the top of our pinion brace. Then we could come to this side where I put a Johnny joint in the frame side bracket, and I put a mark, as you can see right there, that lines up with the bottom of the Johnny joint weld-in bung. So we're gonna make our cut here. Once we get this in position, we'll know exactly where this bracket's gonna sit, and we can tack it onto the top of the pinion brace. So we got our links installed here. Here and here, we have a nice even gap, and with that angle being like that, our Johnny joint, same thing, we got equal gaps on each side. Since this is at ride height, this is sort of our neutral position, We want everything to have as much gap as possible, and then it can articulate as the suspension travels in either direction. Now that we have this in position, I could do a bunch of heavy tacks, and that will locate our inner axle side 4-link brackets. Okay, so now that we got all of our 4 links installed on the rear, we are going to start with our shock bracketry. So we got this bracket that's going to go on the side of the frame, and then here's one of our 14-inch long king shocks. We have a bolt holding our shock assembly in, and then at the bottom, we have a nice shiny new bracket that we cut on the plasma table. And as you can see, as we bring it up to our axle tube, they fit nice and snug around them, and we can position them left to right a little bit, leave enough room between our e-brake and our lower shock stand here. What we could do now is just hold it in place and then put a couple tacks on both of these brackets. Once these brackets are tacked in, we'll have to tack in this bracket too. So we got the entire rear suspension here all tacked in. We got this bracket for our frame side of our links. We got our outer link running to our bracket that we tacked on to our axle on the outer side. Then moving back, we got our shock bracket tacked on and our frame side shock bracket tacked on. Got some bolts through there. Moving on to the inner, this is our inner flex joint and sits into our bracket that's tacked on to our pinion brace. And then running up and over the other end, the Johnny joint goes into our frame side bracket. Next, what's gonna happen is that we're gonna cycle the suspension. We're gonna put one side up, one side down, both sides up, both sides down, and make sure that everything that we have here, all these parts, don't run into anything on the frame, and just double check everything while it's just in the tack position before everything gets final welded. That way, if we have an issue, we can easily fix it now, because once you final weld something, it's a major pain to get it off again. Here we are. So this would be our fully compressed position. As you can see, we have plenty of space between the arms and the frame. E-brake bracket does not get in the way at all. And all of our joints have stayed centered. They haven't even started to articulate yet. What I want to do is from this position, put a jack stand under one side, and then I could bring the jack down. Now bring down just one side at a time. We don't need this anymore here. And we'll pull out our other side jack stand. Our flex joints are starting to articulate back and forth a little bit, but there's still plenty of gap everywhere. So that's what we want to see. Now we got our shock travel fully out, extended on one side. We still got a good amount of clearance with our shock tabs, which is awesome. And we'll double check this side. Pretty good. Now on this side, if you notice, we're getting kind of close to our caliper here. So what I might want to do to make sure the spring's not going to rub right here in this position, we might need to undo these tacks and slightly move this bracket over. This is exactly why we do all these tests. So it's not going to be very often where you have one wheel fully compressed and the other wheel fully uncompressed, but we want to make sure that this is going to work in all scenarios. Okay, so now that we're all tested and cycled, I want to make sure that we have enough room between our calipers on both sides. We are ready to pull this thing apart so we can take all these tacks and make them final welds. All right, as you can see, we got the whole rear end onto the weld table. There's a lot of spots to be final welded. Before we do any of that, there are seals made out of rubber and plastic that are inside the tube. Also, some of these caliper components have rubber seals as well. So what we want to do is just pretty much strip the rear end off. We're going to be taking off the hub, the rotor, the caliper, and then we'll take out the rear gear set. So once all that stuff is stripped out, then we don't have to worry about all the heat from all this welding ruining our seals. Okay, we got all the final welding done on our axle side. As you can see, we got lots of various welds going on, all these components. Now that that's all done, we can start reassembling everything else. So the gear set could go in the back, get a new seal for the cover. We could put our rotors and bearings back on, and then our caliper assemblies as well. Before we put everything else back together, I had forgotten about one thing I wanted to weld on here, and that's box end plates for our shock mounts. Okay, we got our box end plates welded on, looking good. And now that that's done, we're gonna reseal this rear pinion cover.
All right, so I'm gonna jump in and help Dave with some of his welding on the big K20 or whatever the heck that is project. I'm gonna weld up these link arms. So first step is I'm gonna get all the hardware out of them and prep this stuff up and throw some nice pig beads on it. So I sent our customer a picture of the 4-link bars and asked him what color he wanted them painted. And he said he liked the way they look just like this. So I'm gonna go ahead and do this to the other two, and then we'll clear coat them, throw them back on the truck. Got our 4 links installed over here, so that means the next step is getting our shocks in. So before, when we were in the mock-up stage, we left the springs off so that we could compress and extend the shock, but now that we're putting in final assembly and we want it to hold the weight of the truck, we're going to put our springs onto our shocks. So here we got a couple different springs, front and rear. On our rear shock here, we're going to be using one 350 and one 600, and you can see that they're different heights. So the lighter spring is going to go on the top, which will be the longer one, and the shorter spring is going to go on the bottom. Each one rests on either side of this collar mount. They also have adjustability here, and then there's also the top collar, which gives compression to our top shock here. All right, so now that we got our wheels and our shocks, we're back on the ground, and this thing is fully done in the rear. We have our pinion angle set,
Everything is centered, left to right, back to front. The only thing that's not done is our bump stops. In doing the inventory, they were missing. We contacted the company, they're on back order, so we gotta wait. But that's not gonna stop us from working on this truck. We're gonna move ahead to the front and do all of our front link bar and coilover suspension install. And then by the time that's done, our bump stops will arrive and we'll do them on all 4 corners of the truck. So that's it for this episode. Don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, so you don't miss out on seeing the full build on this truck.